Vitaly, friends. I Vitaly Portnikov, and our present to you from Ostrich will Privazina fact, yak developing go on the Russian-Ukrainian front, and the Russian-American mutual. And at a discount, Russian President Putin is really ready to make real compromises. Tied up and completed the Russian-American American intelligence PIV comradeship. According to one of the high-ranking representatives in Congress from the United States. There's another Putin at a time, Nikola's yak of complete decisiveness, continued this guilt and mockty on the battlefield. And yet such a member of the president with Donald Trump's received in the state and tied up, and with prip on him in the fire on the battlefield, do not achieve their real results. All information unacceptable to the White House in the exhibition hall of the American Intelligence Services. And the fact that Donald Trump continued the reports of his peacemakers. Discounts can reveal the results. Well, for the cob. I want to tell you, even in exchange for once to get his henchmen to their analytical exhibitions in intelligence spiffs. I still respect for you a man with an analytical mindset is unlikely to be a Vikov's service, including the service on intelligence speculations, will require discipline. And discipline, I'm a head analyst. So the Kola analyst firm their intelligence services robs the exhibition, and besouses himself on the discovery of information. On the imperious look at our political processes. I respect the topic in principle, not to trust that I am more realistic than the exhibition, by presenting in the intelligence spief. Then the kind of analysts in pursuit of the value of the intelligence does not matter. And serve in the received states of Russia in the powers. And the fact that politicians trust the exhibitions of intelligence spirits, I, as a rule, miss the fatal washings of their political course. I've been shitting the American intelligence services for a few months on the political maps of the retinue of the Radinsky Union, and exhibitions about the burden of continuing and again and the powers. And the most prodigal and distant in reality in the exhibitions was called the famous Promova of the pegged American President George H.W. Bush at the Verkhovna Rada for the sake of Ukraine. And the torture here did not seem to be that the American president was fighting Russia's guilt with Ukraine, and inherited Ukrainian independence. There was just his imperious look, tied up firm the guilt of the pegged Yugoslavia to PPR 35 Rocky after George Bush sent his propaganda. We can be absolutely sure that, in principle, the Moor is simply in the fault between Russia and Ukraine. Which from the point of view of the American president is not enough in 1990. On the truth began in 2014, and I continued to whine in 2020 another. The fact that on Spratkla she did not become a dramatic menage and a tragic mensch for the postradian, just for the sake of his share of the mesh. One more point, on why I'm talking about the analysis of intelligence services for the base, and what I respect is the topic of analysis. To determine with you. Developed by Vidminu Analytics on Civil Can Information, up to we are on my access. Real decryption and telephone minds, the Okolniki in the powers, in the general staffs, in the intelligence services. Real understanding, and about the intentions of politicians and statesmen. And there is no need to analyze it. Here it is simply necessary to read the text of the scope. Let's say the President of the Russian Federation has negotiated with the Minister of Defense of Russia, and the Chief of the General Staff plans for Russia to blame, say, for 3 or 4 more. It is still necessary that you have a productive and effective guilt, and do not need anything to analyze of it. You know, of course, that Putin with full decisiveness and 20 will pass in an atmosphere of endless terrible guilt. That the real us is the Russian president, and not one of his protocol statements. So, in principle, what I'm getting at is that we are going to raise the situation tied up with Russian-Ukrainian guilt. And we can clearly say more American intelligence to the May radio. And greedy real signs of the completion of Russian-Ukrainian guilt to the Osyazhny Maybit Yak not and again, and not and sleep. And the dream is really difficult to complete the guilt. The yak can occur as a result of the exiled and serious impression of the president from the received states on the president of the Russian Federation. To an economical attack by force. Vecno is important. In 1 hour, Vecno for the cob of the third light guilt due to the hanging out of the nuclear component and the exchange of strategic nuclear strikes between the received states and the Russian Federation. In principle, the choice of the Mish itself is overgrown with the end in the fire on the Russian-Ukrainian front and with the rise of Russia, and the approach to the conflict and with the haul in territories and resources. There is still the obit of Ukraine, and the Russian Federation from the United States has already entered the escalation zone. Yakoyak rules to produce up to a forgotten tens of millions of people in us by political and viscose grinding. And I'm talking about the fact that such a lot of wine is on steam, and we can soon say goodbye to millions of people by talking to 2020 others. Speaking simply, mock on the was is still such a fault, and yak is the fault of Russia against Ukraine. She is a vagina to blame for the fact that the parties are absolutely protolesny, looking at the guilt of Russia against Ukraine already. In the fierce 2020 of another rock, the secret of the Zahidny comrades was being scouted from the outside of Syria. And in principle, the original expression is that it is already approximate to, estimate, fierce on the cob. It became clear that the Russian Federation will not go shvidka for Kiev, the centers of Ukraine and territories, and the puppet regime is frequent. It became clear that all the blame would continue, and I would still approach their 7 hanging hands. At least that's how the guilt continued in Syria until the opposition of the Bashar's regime was encapsulated in the province of Dlit. Before the speech, we can say even in those situations. And Russian aggression was revealed encapsulated in the exposed territories of Donetsk, Lugansk and Kherson, beyond Paris and the precinct Kharkiv regions. And himself and here for 3 Rock and Paul, there is a theater of combat day without their wonderful and serious men. Even before the occupation of the territory. And in terms of Russia, I could be just from the point of view, and it is clear that it is not up to Ukraine. Because of the jealousy of the Syrian opposition itself. Yakozekepsulevana on the territory of one province with parallel organs of power. Failure over the degradation and dismantling of the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Purchases and control over the whole of Syria are still in vain, as you know. Putin approaches the situation tied up with and over Ukraine by the cynics and the powers, approximately as the Syrian oppositionists come to the idea of the Bashar regime. Fighting for the degradation of the Ukrainian rear. And you do not hand over what is rich, then on and on the yak center of guilt with the front line to the Ukrainian rear. On the was, in fact, the systematic and serious work of the Ukrainian infrastructure that has been dumped by the Russian Federation, due to the displacement of the Ukrainian population. Immediately, and the pub to the center and the call, from the center, and the call to the Ukrainians of Europe, so that about the pure territory of Yaku Putin, you help us to translate into the territory of Russia. A kind of disloyal population with incorrect ethnic characteristics is a political field. One important point from the point of view of Russia, the moment is absolutely unrealistic. This is not Moscow Razra. Lead up to the Ukrainian population against the imperious Vlad capitulating to Russia. And the weather is all mines and will stick out and Moscow in order to get a bombardment of Ukrainian places out of the normal wall. For those who will still prepare halls on the territory of Ukraine. And the fact that there are no any analogies in history. And the fact that as a rule, bombardment of public places produces to the consolidation of the population. And everyone is not up to his adoration in the open gates of the occupiers. It is absolutely not Putin's general. Well, before the speech, I can also tell you in Syria that the opposition to the regime of Bashar al-Assad. The regime has full control over the territory of Ukraine. Not as Paustini speaking in the areas of uncontrolled positions wasn't, until not pretended to be on a canoe mass itself the Syrian army. And this is an absolutely crazy story. The fact that those armies are the arguments of the moose, having bothered and with the fortune of the Syrian president. We stream the opposition on Tilka. Then this army was me to the power in Ukraine itself in the rear, and the army on the factual front line. In the positions of the position. In Ukraine, there is nothing like this in nature. That's the moment for the ruinous ways. The moment has come. I am so in the chair of the readiness of the Russian president before the long war from Ukraine. There was a change of the legislative base. I am Maya, you can mobilize and get away from the Russian temples on the front lines. So that purchases I am not on Ukrainian territory at the time of the degradation of Ukrainian, then at the time of surrender. Russian troops are on the territory. I am still attached to Russia with the fact that on the territory I will not go beyond the visa. A puppet regime was established, ready to diet in the fairway of Russian politics. The fact that there are no bright real ones for serious treason on the front line according to Putin. I will not say about the fact that, in principle, the adoration of the sign of realism. Dogmatism mirrors the position of the Russian president, then came out about Ukraine. And today, we again chatted and asked the president of the Russian Federation about the position of journalists to come to Pokrovskaya. That they will chat there as well. We are well on course, even himself propaganda crock. With direct exposure to the Ukrainian and adoration to show Zakidny reporters the front line. And torture on these ambushes. That the Russians burned the ruble in the Kharkiv region. After all, it is not formally annexed by the Russians of the territory. And Zakidny journalists in Kharkiv, I bold it in Byte Russian, Ukrainian location. But rhetorical torture. Again, and in order to continue this long guilt, it is impossible to get not the adoration of resiliency. Our demand pennies and people. Well, tell them the president of the Russian Federation can cut out torture with people. Again, there are pennies in order to pay contract workers, and Putin has been serving for a penny. In the largest army in the history of Russia, for the first time, standing in the budget of the Russian Federation. It is known that it is possible to spend pennies on hand in order to provide for nigh and abandoned. And people are ready, and you are in the hands of Ukrainians. It is possible to say an important fact. The rate of status degradation of the Russian economy. Degradation of the economy abroad, an ambush to mobilize that food and 4 pennies and the army into slavery. And the Gersha will be with the Russian economy and the set of people up to the dropped forces. Such a line of wiring under the influence of the Koran, Chipisno ends the degradation of the power itself. Poor temple, Teshaim and I'm smart economical balance we don't know. And so the expression is also Putin is already thinking about prices. And thinking off about the Russian capital. You have all been bashing Moscow's maps from the point of view of missile defense by wind defense. As the Russian capital is honed so that Moscow interferes with the opponents of the authorities of the Russian Federation. I still have Ukraine on dropping missiles. And will the Russian province to fill, and not the bag of Moscow, not in Russia, but also in the Russian province of Russia, atom sound power. In a regional center brand of Sinter. I will punish Baidu about the full court of the Russian ethnic areas, the edges in the Russian Federation. To share the mesh in the national republics of Russia. There is still plenty of food for these people, both monogamous and monolithic. And in Moscow, there is bound up and not hatred. And Muscovites are so casually, and Moscow is still tied up with their full advantage, to the fact that you are in the province. Continue already richly the old man, and I will still go into Putin, it is clear my empire, and I will continue. And invent for myself, not trying about demographic and economic potential. What kind of economy? And the kind of Trump and the kind of his sanctions will be lying around. In principle, the sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft can seriously change the potential of the Russian economy. To create problems for purchasing naphtha, the most for Petra enterprises of India. And we are already talking with New Delhi about the fact that several Indian companies, including a private kind of construction, have purchased Russian naphtha. One robot's claim for getting not to read the Indian media in order to beat this situation intelligence. And what does that mean? It means DOS simple speech that Moscow for waking up namaga minimizuity. Those excesses of the typovyas cannot be. Specific India was bought by Russian NAFTA under illegal schemes, Pashukam reduced for those Indian non-American sanctions policy. In those situations, let's say like this, in the edge for us, in the variant, Russia can spend up to 100 in its energy revenues. Figure. I'm at Mabit him to get on the income of the Russian budget. In Gersh and for us in option beyond Gersh, Russia can spend up to 2,500 in its energy revenues. With Yaki, Indian enterprises will be ready to continue with Moscow. Pull the situation realistically, there is no simple reason for it. Sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil are not worth the diet. I am still the president of the Russian Federation. I am not tied to compromises with Russian-Ukrainian guilt. And not out and 20-leaf fall diets will be honored, and their results will not be given as signs. In the period of Nakacha Grudnya, 2025 Grass, 2026. No one has said that for a certain period there will be no rights but serious sanctions against the Russian Federation. That's the situation Maya saw with such a rank. Trump will send both sanctions packages and davits to Ukraine. I will throw them off. saying that the President of the Russian Federation has a comfortable mind, that the American Ochilnik has a fierce hand. And I have become for Putin complete bezgludium, that allegedly and Russian-American intelligence is not. That Putin did not choose everything and ends up guilty and rich. In other words, we respect American intelligence as it is. And Trump jokes with Putin's years, so that tell him they are already pressed on Kiev. So that Kiev praises Trump and Putin will be added to those minds of Zaki. About discounts, Putin seems for you on mines and Trump. And I'll just kind of compliment and say I'm important Trump. Again today, the press secretary of the President of the Russian Federation, Dmitry Peskov. Trump is exhausted for rights and but sanctions. The fact that Trump has the idea of a fix will reduce the guilt when hiring in the greatest 2026 rock for what? I have to magic dates yellow and perform in the 2026 hand. Speech to the Nobel Committee about awarding the Nobel Prize to the mayor and before the elections to Congress. With the results obtained in the state, Trump absolutely does not want to give the Democrats helplessness and incompetence, and that we cannot blame for 2 or 3. You have no doubt that the process will continue to talk and talk and talk. Both Republicans and Democrats are important in choosing to advocate for the Ukrainian market because of the corruption of Russia. Well, Trump extremely wanted to be a Nobel Prize winner, and I think you are of course still. I still manage for him, for the war in Ukraine to Zhovny 2020, and based on the guilt of the outcome, which is extremely. Then I ended up being a real contender for the prize. And the prize and richly who will pass the test, and the scores in order to award. And Putin absolutely does not care about the Trump Prize. Putin needs Ukraine. Putin needs to see the cordons of the Radian Union. And I'm going to tell them now that we are trying to collapse. This is the Russian Empire. I'll tell them so it's falling apart in our eyes. The Russian Empire, the Russian Federation. The Russian Empire is a Kalish Radian Union. The peg is drunk amicably by the independent powers. In fact, it is not Russia that should be handed over to save control over the Kalishni and the Radian republics. On the chest of 1990, Russia itself embroidered me and then Vlad. What will be the economy here? As the political landscape looks like on Tilka in Ukraine, you are, of course, practical everywhere in Latvia, in Estonia. And Russia will also lose all the blame from Ukraine. It is actually in spending its entire empire. To spend practically in all the pegged Radian republics to sleep and bash the persecution and the Rask of Moscow. You could have watched. Then I went to the presidents of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, and the Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, passed before Donald Trump and signed a declaration from him in his honor about the bag's love of Ukraine. Yaka opened the road of transport corridors in the Beer Caucasus. Those transport corridors and Putin himself of the Federal Service of the Russian Federation. You know, literally in a few days, you will have the first summit with the sweat of the Central Asian states before Donald Trump. The representatives of Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan and Turkmenistan will arrive. And I want to tell you even those presidents themselves come to the kind of vision summits. To the head of the People's Republic of China Xi Jinping. That's why it's overgrown. After all, you don't think much about Putin, although he goes there before him on the 9th of May. And you don't think I'm going to leave the balance sheet and swim into Washington and the region. In the region behind the soft pit of Moscow. In fact, I also knocked out the Republic of Moldova. Little Ukraine failed with a sample of Russians. And control over it was inherited from the cob of presidential and then parliamentary elections. In you perfectly bachel. And who really helps with this process? The theme of the collapse of the imperial can lead Moscow, Ukrainian soldiers. I am not yet an abomination on the cordons of our Ukraine. I am not yet an abomination on the Zine line. Between the Russian-Ukrainian troops, everything is Bulow. And I want you to be absolutely clear, yet Russia will be given to smoke Putin into the Ukrainian state. I will mean a fiasco, and for all the Kalishny-Radian republics of Russia, I will be ready for all sorts of cruel carrots of skin. And for Ukraine and Central Europe, I will also mean a civilizational paste, and may not come out offensive. And Kola, you feel about the fact that the Ugric Prime Minister Viktor Orban is already ready to make this split with the Prime Minister of both Slovakia and the Czech Republic, so that are leaders of European integration, of course. That as a result, so Horba. It may be that Ukraine can still stand up for a lot less, and it's rich that we will lose. So it's really a fee for what you will experience, but there will be no ready-made diet for discounts. At the moment, the decision of the diet, and before the surrender. Trump, in turn, with full decisiveness cracked on Putin to indulge his economical desires. It is necessary for an economical and political collapse of the Putin regime, on the basis of a serious eating of the prospects of the very vorag, on the chauvinism of the Russian population. And this means that when hiring at the moment, the parties will go through a confrontation. Serious confrontations, vagit guilt. The washing on the topic of the gentry before the confrontation can be made from the fact that Putin wants to demonstrate there are not yet victims of Poseidon's petrels and yars, and that I am a rocket for a wife in direct Ukraine, and Trump can show that he is not yet a victim, and is ready to defend both allies and a rocket to get a Russian rocket into B. And the third holy wine, my lucky custom, because the wine Zadie is happy to millions of people. And the unfortunate victims are given a minimum of the victim of happiness of guilt, sacrifice, and unhappiness. I will be once, no one knows. That is, the algorithm, of course. Maybe some of you are bought a new movie with Dynamite American. I am, and in principle demonstrates the algorithm. Nobody knows yet. I will say again, a nuclear power has struck at the nuclear account. Not as clearly and visibly behaved the testing is not May. We know about Tilke, that during the hours of the Biden administration, the director of the Central Development Directorate with a staff obtained, knocked out the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation. And you and I don't know much about the prefix of the American development of creativity. You know, we all don't rush them. What did I tell him? What we don't know. Chinov, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, is Trump's emissary and has met with the Russian, and is firm in Biden's ultimatum of his actual, tough bill, but we don't know. The algorithm, and the sky is the algorithm. We also know that there can be a boot. I'll tell him again. Nuclear Ukraine is on the nose of a nuclear strike on nuclear Ukraine. You know? It is created for us to the fact that in order to read with Duvt, this is Yak Sodi, and the algorithm, and of course, another blow as if announced. The problem is that nuclear Ukraine was in NATO rich and has said nuclear proxies of Ukraine. Tell me more. The Russian Federation, The People's Republic of China adore a non-nuclear strike on the territory of the United States. Received for Beer Korea, then absolutely without Gluzny goes to see Russia. And I want an American place as a wife in May. Well, Tiki, but there can be no such buts without Lich. One more point. Me and I are so important. And yet another nuclear power strikes a nuclear power to help the conventional reset. There is a cob of extreme guilt in the nuclear dump. For example, Russia with a missile strike without snacking on a nuclear dump to the Ramstein airfield base. I would have given R to enter Ukraine. What this means is that Sasher will get out of the nuclear dump. The missile drop will be directed against the Russian Federation. On all types of tortures on the Sunda and Maya kind of lead. And it may not be so classic, we're having a conversation. And a new technological turn of the droney wine, for example. Allowing an anonymous drone attack from the territory of arming Ukraine at the facility, showed the Ukrainian web apparatus. I write down the buckets in the apparatus, saying that in principle this apparatus is just a gateway to the third color fault in opening the door. Well, tell me, we are aware of drones attacking the Ramstein base from the territory of the such American temple services. And Russia has not seen in plain sight of the Ukrainian intelligence services that are on the territory of Russia. And the Russians in the hall do not see that it can be so and proxy. By the hour of the terrorist organization, I am actually both a penny and a penny from Moscow. Such terrorist organizations were Vitaly and in France, and the Radinsky Union. No one is in their functioning. Prichulak did not find them in his head on the territory of the Radinsky Union. In principle, I can hold up to the third light guilt in a completely new look so richly that we can already overgrown in the rada of continuing escalation just into shape. And the right-wing Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk is all the fault in, of course, the fault in since there was Russian-Ukrainian wine in 2014, in 2020 other lessons. It was Prapana's fault. And you and I and the entrance and the 2026th Rick will be such an incredible lesson, the wine will become reference. The fault is not with a tank and infantry, but with a drone and missiles. And I'll be Kavisha, I'm for. Well, such exhibitions are possible today, incredibly, from an exhibition in American intelligence. I will ask you to subscribe to the channel. I will be in Diagno to the Skin, who signed up for the ethers. I will guess that we have literally heard 30,000 to a million. Be 30,000? Put it appropriately. Comment on what you think about the prospects of the Russian-Ukrainian guilt of Tai. So that Vanya has the germ of the third light guilt 20 channel, and we will read the torture, and try to hang on often. What will be produced for what protest with received in the States? According to your idea, I think that the protests received in the States are frequent on democratic functionaries. People come out to protest, show that they are not with the aspect of the policy of American President Donald Trump. This is absolutely normal for democracy. Those people will be able to speak at the 2026 lesson and see their votes for Republican opponents in the elections before Congress. It is in the interests of the administration that there should be an economical situation and there should be fewer protests, because it's in vain that all of you are in this economy. So put pressure on the protest chain element of democracy. You turned out to be both Putin and Ukraine. That's why your mind is ticking. Putin's chauvinistic regime is an example from Kazakhstan, he is from Ukraine. But we are not so simple. I'm trying to tell you what to do in the test. Well, I'm trying to explain the form to you with a Schlyack. The main idea of the Russian political routes with 1,990 puros was in the Kalishny Radian republics. All behind the sweep of Ukraine, the Baltic independence was caused by the sovereign Rada of the Rudinsky Union, so-called a geopolitical refrigerator that they could not go anywhere, which means a geopolitical refrigerator. The Kalishny of the Radan Republic have a brother and a fate in the integration processes of the mind with Russia, and to join the greedy. Integration united Yakupshal and busy participants in the workshop united and the Kalishny Radian republics. Let's say, with the butt of such integration unions, I decide to accept Russia. Then not yet allow it to be seen in the Russian state, in the cordons of the USSR, and I am NATO and the European Union. Allegedly, the uprising marks the period of Leonid Kuchma's presidency. Russia Shlyakem Kilko special operations directly against the friend of the President of Ukraine. I managed to accept firm this Kuchma to please about a single economic space with Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan. The whole deal was torpedoed by Obama's challenger for the presidency of Ukraine. I came to Viktor Yanukovych and Viktor Yushchenko for different reasons. Viktor Yushchenko and matchmakers Ukraine in big Europe, and Viktor Yanukovych himself will be an integrator. And he brought the Russian world to Ukraine. At one time in the hour of Yanukovych's stay at the Prime Minister's landing of Ukraine before the Yushchenko periods of the year, she was not issued with an obvious rank, and Yushchenko pretended to be at the temple during the presidential election. With such a rank, Ukraine came as a nobleman of European integration, already in the hours of Yushchenko and Yanukovych. And becoming president of Ukraine, the reasons for what you find. I think that brother and pennies are everywhere. I am writing to continue working on the prescription of the years about the European Association. Now, from the point of view of Russia, it was absolutely not empty of what was not allowed to go. It included Ukraine and Maybut to the Eurasian Economic Union. Putin managed to sign Yanukovych, that is, in order to please the maiden 2014 rock in Moscow. It became clear that to please they would be signed, and she came with a Schlyack. As she had already been thrust into the pegged Radian republics, it was enough to show independence in her geopolitical choice. On the was of the Republic of Moldova and sadness. Obstinate provinces on the power of a disabled person. You decline from Moldova, it was Transnistria, Kola was Gagauzia, Abkhazia fell out with Georgia, you bring beer. In our case, it became Crimea and Donbass, and in order to make the whole situation residual. The narthex on Putin did not come to the stile on the porch of the Crimea on a quasi-fallow power, but on the passage of the Crimea to the Russian Federation. In support of Putin's effigy, Ukraine has not changed its geopolitical course, and Zahid. Without changing his look at the Maybutton of Ukraine, I often look at the NATO of the European Union. Even before the fact that the president received in the state in the tone was Joseph Biden, saying that the occupation of the territory is frequent on the territory of Ukraine, and the behavior of NATO standards is turned off and off, not charging for all the declarativity of her phrase, for the Russian Krevny. It meant the failure of their attempts for up to the prescription of the disabled power. Ukraine to Ukraine, I Nikola will not frequent other people's integration facilities. There was praise for the decision of the famous Vlad in Kiev by the power Schlyack and the Kola in 2020. In another kind of decision was a fiasco of the president of the Russian Federation. You obtained control over Ukraine by way richly personal guilt on Wyslizhny. We're at those points. Kazakhstan is still hanging out, let's tell him. Its president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, was one of the head of the Russian integration Obednik, advocated the idea of a shot of the Eurasian Union. Nazarbayev to take the initiative. Bill Obstova on Russian President Yeltsin. I'll mark it up. Nur Sultan Abashevich Zebra and us journalists, yaks were accredited in Moscow at the Embassy of Kazakhstan in the Russian Federation. Firma Paperchik reading out the reaction of the Kalishny Radian republics to his initiative of the Narthex, of the spirit of the amicably fallow powers to the Eurasian Union. Everyone had an extremely strong reaction to this. Narva can be infected by the fact that the warehouses of the population of Ukraine are not Kazakhs, and he needs an hour in order to create Kazakhstan for a national power without anti-Kazakh sentiment for the Russian ethnic population itself. At times, Kazakhstan is a member of the Shanghai Piracy Organization, a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, a member of the STO. Go into that very geopolitical refrigerator. Me and us, so he needed it. Ponats will be on themselves in the subject of Katya will be engaged. This is absolutely the right pit. Chebok Putin is away. If the loss in the pit on the was in the waste of the occupied territories, she will not save them. That pestering on all visits on the downloaded fault. I think that Putin Zagoli, without thinking not about the yaks of the loss of guilt, and not about the yaks for the President of the Russian Federation, is absolutely sure that he will be able to win the war. That Ukraine is on the political maps of the retinue, that Russia will expand on the peg of the Radian Republic. The basics are presented on his. Therefore, I do not think that Putin is bashing his filthy, although it is clear that reality. And you also know Adolf Hitler in his imperious self-murder. The fact that do not think about the Balkans, think about the realities. You will often find that Putin is a weak strategist. That is why Vinza is plundering his special shares in the strategy, and what the toe screw is laying on the parts of his ally. Well, I think Putin is a sweet strategist. What Putin really is, of course, I will look at the situation in a series of special apparatuses. The skin will bring it closer to the result. The strategy does not think, and I will see Rocky in the shadows in 10 minutes. The strategy is to avoid the fact that I'm in 10 Rocky. Putin doesn't think so yet. Here at a time you are a special. The equipment of the Ukrainian infrastructure in order to freeze and not smoke it out of Ukraine. And then you torture, and not yet freeze, to smoke out of Ukraine, then further. Then I will be offensive special. I'm still important to raise the situation, to blame for the uprising in the same place. 3.5 hands will soon be there. The ears are the same. You still have a special party, one after another, one ends, you start, but then I don't respect the strategy. You're confusing the strategy out of Maria. And the strategy of these beads, of course, I will develop a situation about the fact that the 10th 15th hand. And what do you want me to do? And I will reach really. Strategy, I want Ukraine and everything in the world, the Russian Empire to be the emperor of all the light and Trump. But Putin has a strategy for string instruments of such. And so filthy. We're a dog. And what kind of Russian NAFTA, car products are poured into China by the Kremlin elite on Putin for him? Well, extremely Russian NAFTA, serious problems of the Russian economy. Still China, India will not have Russian NAFTA, and we will have Russian bombs at the auto assembly plants. Then the test on filling is unnecessary. And I don't think that China is ready about the Russian at the moment on the adoration of the People's Republic of China, to the empty loss of Russia. I think I'm going to think, and go through the instruments of Russia, yet India Russian on their pop and tesh. How else does he want from the brigade? So the situation is not so simple. About the influx of the Russian elite to Putin, I believe in Zagolina. That I respect the creative classical regime of one WASP lad in Russia. Everyone likes to talk about the Kremlin towers and the Nastra massacres. It's all one thing eating one person. And from the point of view of Putin's personalistic regime, I am for Russian political culture. Starting from the 5th Ben 1953rd lesson. The personalist mode is clean and looks. In Russia, after the turn of the 1917th rock, and again approached the 21,933rd lesson, Stalin managed to get all his consultations in the Central Committee of the VKB. Until the death of Stalin in Bern, 1953rd lesson. Until that hour from the 1917th lesson to 1933rd, and the hour from 1953rd to 1990 in the Radian Union, and again jealousy. Despite the strong influx of the General Secretary of the party, people voted in the Politburo. This vote was absolutely not, and there was a massacre on and a massacre on the way in. 1990 years ago, Boris Yeltsin happened to be on a stick. From the mood of his imperious to the political and his competitive sign. And Putin is probably 2000 of the fourth rock from the cob of his stay on another term of the President of the Russian Federation. And there will also be an exact defeat from the Yukos company. And after all, the bets of Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Kasyanov are a student of the presidential administration of Alexander Voloshin, no longer on anything. And if 2020 to another personalist regime, becoming a personalist regime of totalitarian Ukraine. So forget about the Russian elite. Putin can be about the rumor of life. Why the Russians did not buy the whole of Georgia in the 2008 kind. We were not ready for a direct confrontation with the sun. To what I'm guessing right now, before a direct confrontation with the sunset, with Gidno and his own and the apple tree. And about civilizational Russians, the bees will prepare Tilky, the counselor of the SB with the energy hormone of Europe. What we talked about with you not once in different broadcasts and on YouTube. I've been coming with you since 2014. Cola can be printed out in cola, a beer pot is extracted too. The Ukrainian gas transportation system is an element of blackmail for Russians from the side of Kiev's Europeans. And it was Georgia's fault. The Russians were reshuffled, ready for such an economical confrontation, for sanctions, for Gazprom's expansion, for underwater loans. Because it actually meant that it could not buy Georgia, it's true. And as a result, Nikola will not be able to buy Ukraine. Of course, Koshiva's death is not in Tbilisi, but in Kiev. I still have you not control over Ukraine, and you are not real visible in the empire. The Russian Empire I in Europe did not begin the conquest of the Beer Caucasus. Supposedly, of course. And Yaslova from the partition of Poland. Russia, standing head politic gram in Europe. And the layout of the Rudinsky Union itself at 1991st lesson. Who at a time in Russia sent them to Ukraine? IAS controlled half of not Mekina, cleaning, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland. Albania has its hour and Yugoslavia in the last period of another light guilt. Think about it, if you swim in Russia, then. Think again, the Russian fleet was not in Sevastopol, Tilkunova, we had happiness smoked. And in Lara, along the Albanian port, after smoking it out, Russian ships were standing there. And even if it wasn't for the welding of Stalin's stars, then it sounds like Russia has little actual position to play. Well, today's Russia still has such a naga. But the Zagarbani of Ukraine, it turns all these real ones. She turned Russia to the European level from Putin's point of view. Tom needs so much for Ukraine, for its entire territory, there will still be a reason. Russians need a not bad climate on this, bullshit. What else is there a good climate in Crimea? And in Russia, Crimea, I'm Vikova base. In other words, Ukraine can pretend that it fell to the ground so that the Russian missile division would stand in the place of destruction. And Putin, ready to pay an economical demographic price for a hook. Millions of Russians have already died. There I am still. Russia will not be the gendarme of Europe. Why does he need these millions? That it will be in Blagoveshchenskaya with the Chinese to trade. Funny. So much for the logic. Putin Pershi Russian are right to having deployed Russia. We will expose Peter's discounts, and not reason wants to go through all the skids. In a way to look like a Pole, and ready for everything by ultra-right politicians and Europe. And Tilky. I'm still the head of the elites, and even more than my Schwitz, I can't remember repeating out of 2020 another. You tell them that all of us have the chances squeezed out on the tick of Ukrainians. Europeans and Americans have it that way. Because what I'm going to drag on, a shadow of light guilt and a nuclear apocalypse. Stein will pretend to be real. Extremely rich, who over time I will order. Sarcastically humming those who may be under the cordon and Ukraine. And everyone snickered sarcastically, they told him that here. And what about the places in proton-nuclear bunkers? Well, here, and I'll get you even before the tag, Putin's teeth are not on the red button yet. Still of course, also on the red button T sign, and not hell. Yeah, we're all fine of course. And I will mark another torture, not in the fact that I adore Putin, continued this war. We are not wearing torture, we are Shukadi kind of torture, in what Putin continued to see it. The chain of torture has been conducted, and the date of Russia's guilt against Ukraine has been completed. What else was on that broadcast? Whether the weasel of the past subscribes to the channel of 30 is already less than 1,000, Yaki. May the static of the channel help the channel with 1 million. Put your own in a podobake. All the tools are available to the channel, and it does not matter very much that it helps the dumped forces of Ukraine at the training camp. I guess my social ones so often.